David Kyle's tactical boots crunch on gravel. The sound is methodical, lonely. It's 5:47 a.m., Trail Ridge Path, 12 miles from the nearest ranger station in the San Gabriel Mountains. He'd started hiking in darkness to outrun the nightmares. Then he sees her. A white dog, skeletal, covered in dried blood and fresh wounds, standing directly in the center of the trail. Not eating, not resting, just standing there with her ears pinned back, staring at David with eyes that have seen hell. David stops. His hand instinctively moves to his hip where his sidearm used to be. The dog doesn't move. Instead, she drops her front legs low, like a bow, and releases a sound David has only heard once before, in Kandahar, from a child trapped under rubble. Not a bark. A wail. A plea in a language that transcends species. Then the dog does something that overrides every tactical instinct David has. She limps forward, closes the 3 feet between them, and clamps her teeth, gently but desperately, around the fabric of his cargo pants. She pulls. Not aggressive, but insistent. Urgent. David's jaw tightens. Those eyes. He's seen those eyes before in mirrors, in the faces of men who knew they were out of time. David Kyle had been home from deployment for 8 months. 8 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days if he was counting, which he told himself he wasn't. He'd survived 3 tours as a Navy SEAL. Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq. The kind of operations that don't make the news because they're not supposed to exist. He'd earned a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and a medical discharge after an IED in Helmand Province left him with a titanium rod in his left femur and chronic migraines that felt like his skull was being split open. The doctors said he was lucky. His commanding officer said he was a hero. The VA therapist, a kind woman with patient eyes, said he was experiencing survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress, and a dozen other clinical terms that didn't capture the truth. The truth was simpler. David Kyle was 32 years old, and he was already a ghost. He lived in a studio apartment in Pasadena that he barely furnished. A mattress on the floor, a coffee maker, a duffel bag of clothes. His sister, Rebecca, had tried to help. She'd bought him curtains, a desk, a potted plant that died within 3 weeks because David kept forgetting it needed water. "You can't live like this, David," she'd said, her voice cracking. "You're not deployed anymore. You're home. You need to start building a life." But David didn't know how to build. He only knew how to breach, to extract, to eliminate threats. His skill set was designed for war, not for the suffocating quiet of civilian life. He'd tried a job doing private security. Lasted 2 months before the boredom and the fake smiles became unbearable. He'd tried the gym, therapy groups for veterans, even a pottery class Rebecca had signed him up for. Nothing stuck. Nothing filled the void where his purpose used to be. The only thing that helped was the hiking. Miles and miles of solitude, where the only voice in his head was his own breathing and the sound of boots on stone. No one asking how he was doing. No one thanking him for his service with that uncomfortable look in their eyes. Just him, the mountain, and the ghosts he carried. The nightmares were always the same. Kabul, August 2021, during the evacuation. David's team had been tasked with securing a route to the airport. They'd moved through a neighborhood reduced to rubble, and that's when they'd heard it, a child's voice, faint, coming from beneath a collapsed building. His team leader had made the call. "We don't have time. The convoy moves in 3 minutes." David had argued, "I can get him out. 30 seconds, I just need 30 seconds. Negative. We move now." They'd left. David had followed orders. That's what you do. You follow orders, you trust the chain of command, you complete the mission. 2 hours later, he'd heard the building had been searched by another unit. They'd found the child. Dead. Dehydrated, alone, 6 years old, clutching a stuffed rabbit. David had saved dozens of lives in his career. He'd extracted hostages, neutralized threats, executed flawless operations under impossible conditions. But that one child, the one he'd left behind, was the only one he could see when he closed his eyes. At 38, Sarah Mitchell had felt ancient. At 32, David Kyle felt dead. He'd stopped returning Rebecca's calls. He'd canceled his VA appointments. He'd started hiking before dawn because the darkness felt appropriate. He was functional, disciplined, alive, but not living. He'd built walls so high that even he couldn't see over them anymore. This morning he'd planned to hike until his leg gave out, until the pain in his femur matched the pain in his chest, until he was too exhausted to dream. Then the dog appeared and everything changed. David stood frozen on the trail, the dog's teeth still holding his pant leg. The animal was shaking, not from cold, but from exhaustion. Her ribs showed through matted fur. The wounds on her body weren't fresh, they were infected, days old. She should have been dead or hiding, not standing here on this trail, not intercepting him. David had seen desperation before. He'd seen it in the eyes of interpreters begging for evacuation. He'd seen it in the faces of mothers holding injured children. He knew what desperation looked like. This dog was desperate. Where? David's voice came out rough and used. He hadn't spoken to another living thing in 3 days. "Where do you need me to go?" The dog released his pants immediately, turned toward the treeline off the trail, and looked back. Her message was clear. "Follow me." No. Every rational part of David's brain cataloged the risks. He was alone, 12 miles from the ranger station. No cell service. His leg was already aching from the 5-mile climb. Following a wild animal off-trail into the San Gabriel wilderness was tactically insane. But something in those intelligent, terrified eyes had breached his defenses. David had spent 8 months trying to forget he'd ever been a SEAL. 8 months trying to convince himself that his training, his instincts, his entire identity was useless here in the civilian world. But this dog wasn't asking for a civilian. She was asking for an operator. Someone who could handle a crisis. Someone who didn't quit when things got hard. Someone who saved people, or in this case, whatever she was protecting. David's hand moved to his hip, checking his gear. Tactical belt, multi-tool, paracord, emergency medical kit, camelback. Muscle memory from 1,000 missions. "All right," he said quietly, his voice steadying, something shifting in his chest. "Let's go get them." He dropped his hiking pack behind a marked tree, keeping only his essentials. The dog was already moving, limping but determined, weaving through dense chaparral and manzanita. David followed, his SEAL training kicking in automatically. He scanned the terrain, noted landmarks, calculated egress routes. The dog moved with purpose, occasionally looking back to ensure David was still there. They'd been moving for maybe 6 minutes when David heard it. A sound that made his blood freeze. A high-pitched, desperate yelp. Faint, muffled, but unmistakable. Coming from somewhere below them. The dog stopped at the edge of what looked like an old collapsed structure, some kind of forgotten industrial site, half buried in debris and overgrowth. She stood at the edge, whining, pawing at the ground, then looked back at David with eyes that said, "This is it. This is why I found you." David dropped to his knees at the edge and peered into the darkness. What he saw made his stomach drop. A flooded pit. Concrete slabs. And somewhere in that black water, barely visible, a tiny white shape struggling to keep its head above the surface. "Jesus," David whispered. The mother dog pressed against his shoulder, whining, pleading, her entire body vibrating with desperate hope. David Kyle had spent 8 months trying to convince himself he had nothing left to give. He was wrong. "I've got this," he told the dog, his voice firm, certain, the voice of an operator accepting a mission. "I'm bringing your pup home." He began stripping off his jacket, his mind already running through the tactical approach. Entry point, obstacles, extraction method, safety margins. For the first time in 8 months, David Kyle wasn't running from his training. He was running toward something worth saving. And maybe, just maybe, he was saving more than a puppy trapped in the dark. But what David finds in that flooded pit will shatter everything he thought he knew about that day in Kabul. The reason this mother dog chose him, out of all the hikers on this mountain, will leave you speechless. And the moment David pulls that puppy from the water and sees what's around its neck, that's when he breaks down completely. If you want to see what happens when David goes into that pit, and discover the shocking connection between this rescue and his darkest memory, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. Because what happens in the next 60 seconds will change David's life forever. And I promise you, you're not ready for this twist. Now let's see if a broken soldier can pull off the most important extraction of his life. David's training took over before his conscious mind could catch up. His eyes swept the collapsed structure in a practiced grid pattern, left to right, top to bottom, identifying hazards the way other people identified faces. Unstable concrete slabs, 45-degree angle, probable weight 200 pounds minimum. Rusted rebar protruding at chest height, tetanus risk. Water level rising. Temperature near freezing based on the vapor coming off the surface. The puppy's yelps were getting weaker, more sporadic. Time window shrinking. He'd done this 1,000 times. Assess the environment, identify the objective, calculate the risks, execute with precision. The difference was that those missions had been planned by strategists in air-conditioned rooms with satellite imagery and backup teams on standby. This mission had been planned by a half-dead dog who'd somehow known exactly who to find. David dropped to his stomach at the edge of the pit, his damaged leg screaming in protest. He ignored it. Pain was just information. And right now it wasn't mission critical. He pulled out his tactical flashlight, the one Rebecca had given him for hiking, and aimed the beam into the darkness. The puppy was there, a tiny white shape barely visible above the waterline, paddling frantically against a concrete slab that had it pinned in a corner. The animal couldn't have been more than 6 weeks old. Every few seconds, its head would dip below the surface, then pop back up with a desperate gasp. David's chest tightened. That sound, that panicked breathing, the way the small body fought against impossible odds. He'd heard it before. In Kabul. Under that rubble. The child he'd left behind had made that exact same sound. The mother dog pressed against David's side, whining, her body vibrating with tension. She wasn't asking anymore. She was watching him the way his team had watched him before a breach, waiting for the signal, trusting that the operator knew what to do. David's jaw set. His hands stopped shaking. The ghosts in his head went silent. "I'm going in," he said, his voice steady, certain, the voice of a man who just remembered what he was built for. "And I'm not leaving without him." He started calculating entry points, his mind already 3 steps ahead, running through contingencies and backup plans. Somewhere deep in his chest, something that had been dormant for 8 months flickered back to life. Purpose. The path down was a nightmare of loose scree and overgrown thorns that hadn't seen human traffic in years, maybe decades. The mother dog moved through it like she'd memorized every step, her body low, compensating for her injuries with the kind of determination David recognized from operators who'd been hit but refused to stop until the mission was complete. She'd glance back every 10 seconds, her eyes locking with his, making sure he was still there, still committed. David followed, his mind cataloging everything. The terrain was getting worse, steeper, the vegetation denser. They were descending into what looked like an old ravine, the kind of forgotten industrial scar that nature was slowly reclaiming. Rusted chain-link fence partially collapsed to their right, warning signs so faded they were illegible. Whatever this place had been, it had been abandoned long enough to become dangerous. The dog's breathing was labored now, her movements slower. She was running on fumes, pushing past exhaustion, past pain, past every instinct that told her to stop and rest. David had seen that before too. In Afghanistan, when a local interpreter had guided them through a minefield to rescue his daughter from a Taliban compound. The man's feet had been bleeding, his body shaking from dehydration, but he hadn't stopped until his child was safe. This mother was no different. She wasn't going to stop. She couldn't. Her baby was drowning, and she'd found the only person in a 12-mile radius who might be able to help. David's leg was screaming now, the titanium rod grinding against bone with every downward step. Sweat ran down his back despite the morning cold. His breathing came harder. His heart rate elevated. The VA doctors had told him his combat days were over, that his body couldn't handle that kind of stress anymore. They were probably right. But they'd never asked if he could handle the alternative, which was 8 months of waking up every morning with no reason to get out of bed. The puppy's cries were louder now, closer, echoing off the concrete and stone. The sound drove into David's chest like a knife. Every yelp was a countdown, a reminder that time was the real enemy here. Not the terrain, not his broken body, but the seconds ticking away while a 6-week-old animal fought to keep breathing. The mother dog stopped suddenly, her body rigid. She'd brought him to the edge of what looked like an old drainage system, a concrete pit partially covered by collapsed industrial debris. The water below was dark, reflecting nothing, revealing nothing. And somewhere in that darkness, something small was running out of time. David dropped to his knees at the edge of the pit, ignoring the way the jagged concrete bit into his kneecaps. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a scene that made his operator's mind shift into high gear. This wasn't just a drainage system. It was the remains of what looked like an old industrial basement, partially collapsed, the floor flooded with at least 4 feet of black water. Concrete slabs lay at chaotic angles, creating pockets and chambers, some above water, some below. The puppy's cries were coming from somewhere deep inside that maze. The mother dog moved to the very edge, her front paws scrabbling at the concrete, whining in a pitch that climbed higher and higher. She'd bark once, sharp and commanding, then pause, listening. The response came back faint, muffled, a tiny desperate cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. David swept his light across the surface. The water was opaque, contaminated with rust and debris and God knew what else. He couldn't see more than 6 inches below the surface. Entry would be blind. The slabs created overhangs, potential trap points where a man could get pinned or disoriented. The space between the collapsed sections looked narrow, maybe 18 inches at the widest point. It would be tight even for someone David's size, and if he got stuck, if the structure shifted, there'd be no extraction team coming for him. He pulled out his multi-tool, extended the blade, and scraped it against the concrete. The sound echoed through the chamber below, metallic and sharp. He listened carefully. The acoustics told him the space was larger than it looked from above, with multiple chambers branching off. The puppy's cries were coming from the deepest point, maybe 15 feet in, behind at least 2 concrete barriers. This wasn't a rescue. It was a cave dive with no equipment, no backup, and no margin for error. The mother dog looked at David, then back at the pit, then at David again. Her message was crystal clear. I got you here. I did my part. The rest is on you. David's jaw tightened. He thought about Cobble, about the child's voice growing fainter as they'd walked away, about 8 months of pretending that walking away had been the right call, that following orders was the same as doing the right thing. The puppy's cry came again, weaker this time, barely audible over the sound of water lapping against concrete. David started unlacing his boots. I'm going in. The water hit David like 1,000 knives. Cold didn't begin to describe it. His body seized, every muscle contracting in shock, his breath coming in sharp gasps. 38 degrees, maybe less. Hypothermia would set in within minutes. He had a narrow window, and it was already closing. He pushed forward, his flashlight clenched between his teeth, the beam dancing across wet concrete and dark water. The space was tighter than it had looked from above. His shoulders scraped against rough concrete on both sides as he squeezed through the first gap between collapsed slabs. The mother dog's barking echoed behind him, frantic, encouraging, desperate. The puppy's cries were louder now, just ahead. David could hear the frantic splashing, the high-pitched yelps punctuated by choking sounds as the animal swallowed water. He pushed harder, ignoring the way the concrete tore at his shirt, his skin. His tactical belt caught on a piece of rebar. He twisted, yanked it free, kept moving. Then he saw it. The puppy was in a corner pocket, trapped beneath a massive concrete slab that had fallen at an angle, creating a triangular prison. Only the pup's head was above water, barely, its tiny paws paddling against the slab with weakening strokes. The animal's eyes were wide with terror, its white fur matted and dark. David lunged forward, reaching through the gap. His fingers brushed wet fur. So close. He stretched further, his shoulder jamming against the concrete opening. Pain exploded through his chest. He couldn't fit. The gap was maybe 14 inches wide. His shoulders were 18. Come on, David growled, twisting his body, trying to collapse his chest, angle his shoulders. Nothing. He was stuck. The puppy's head dipped below the surface, popped back up, dipped again. Above him, on the surface, he heard a sound that split his heart open. The mother dog had found a gap in the debris and was digging, her paws scraping frantically against concrete and dirt, her claws breaking, bleeding, but she didn't stop. She was digging toward her baby with the same desperate energy she'd used to find David. Two soldiers on an impossible mission, neither willing to quit. David pulled back, his mind racing through options. The slab was too heavy to lift from this angle. He couldn't widen the gap with his hands. His multi-tool was useless against concrete. He needed leverage, a fulcrum, something to create space. The puppy went under again. This time it stayed under for 3 seconds. 4. 5. When its head broke the surface, the cry that came out was barely a whisper. David stared at the gap, at the small white head struggling to stay above water, and something inside him shattered. The concrete walls around him disappeared. The freezing water disappeared. He wasn't in the San Gabriel Mountains anymore. He was back in Kabul, staring at a different hole, listening to a different voice crying in the dark. August 2021. The child had been trapped under a collapsed wall, just like this. A gap too small for a grown man to fit through. David had laid on his stomach in the dust, reaching through the rubble, his fingers inches from the boy's hand. So close. The child's voice had been hoarse from crying, weak from dehydration, terrified and alone in the dark. And David's team leader had said, "We don't have time. The convoy moves in 3 minutes." David had pulled his hand back. He'd stood up. He'd followed orders. He'd walked away from that hole while a 6-year-old boy cried for help in a language David didn't speak but understood perfectly. The child had died alone in the dark, still reaching for a hand that never came back. Now, in this flooded pit, David was staring at another gap he couldn't fit through, listening to another desperate cry growing weaker. The universe had given him the exact same scenario. Same impossible geometry. Same crushing time pressure. Same choice. But this time, there was no team leader. No convoy. No orders to follow. This time, the only person David had to answer to was himself. The tears came without warning, hot against his frozen face, mixing with the dirty water dripping from his hair. His chest heaved with sobs he'd been holding back for 8 months, for 3 years, maybe for his entire adult life. He'd spent a decade following orders, trusting the chain of command, believing that doing his job was the same as doing the right thing. But he'd been wrong. And a child had died because of it. The mother dog's digging sounds echoed from above, frantic, relentless. She wasn't asking permission. She wasn't waiting for orders. She was fighting with everything she had because that's what you do when someone you love needs you. David's hands stopped shaking. His vision cleared. The tears didn't stop, but they weren't weakness anymore. They were fuel. "I left him," David whispered to the darkness, to the puppy, to the ghost of a boy in Kabul. "I left him, but I'm not leaving you. Not this time. Not ever again." He pulled himself back through the gap, his mind already calculating a new approach. The mother dog looked at him, her eyes meeting his, and in that moment, they understood each other completely. Some missions you can't walk away from, even if it costs you everything. David surfaced, gasping, his body screaming from the cold. He had maybe 5 minutes left before hypothermia made his hands useless. 5 minutes to do what should take 20. He scanned the debris field with tactical precision, looking for anything that could give him mechanical advantage. There. A piece of rebar, 3 feet long, bent at one end, and wedged between 2 concrete slabs, a section of metal pipe, rust-eaten but solid. David's mind assembled the solution before his hands moved. Basic physics. Leverage. A fulcrum and a lever could move the world if you had the right position. He yanked the rebar free, nearly dislocating his shoulder in the process. The mother dog stopped digging, watching him, her body tense with anticipation. David grabbed the pipe, tested its weight. Good enough. It had to be. He dove back into the water, the shock less severe this time but no less brutal. His fingers were already going numb. He positioned the pipe vertically against the base of the slab that trapped the puppy, wedging it into a crack in the concrete floor. The rebar became his lever. He threaded his tactical belt through the bent end, creating a makeshift pulley point. The geometry was crude, but it would work. It had to work. David planted his feet against the far wall, gripped the rebar with both hands, and pulled. Nothing. He adjusted his angle, used his legs, his back, every pound of muscle he had. The slab groaned, shifted, maybe an inch, maybe less. The puppy's head went under. David roared, a sound that came from somewhere primal, and pulled harder. His titanium rod felt like it was tearing through his femur. His hands were bleeding, the cold water making them slick. He couldn't feel his feet anymore. Didn't matter. The slab was moving, slow, agonizing, but moving. 2 inches. 3. He could see the puppy now, completely submerged, its tiny body floating, motionless. David dropped the rebar, sucked in the deepest breath his frozen lungs could manage, and went under. The water was black, disorienting. His hands swept through the space beneath the slab, found nothing, swept again. His chest burned. His vision started to narrow. Then his fingers closed around something small, soft, and completely still. He pulled himself up, breaking the surface with the puppy clutched against his chest. The tiny body was limp, cold, not breathing. David's training kicked in before despair could. He turned toward the entrance, the puppy cradled in one arm, and started moving. Above ground, the mother dog's howl split the morning air. David hauled himself out of the pit, his arms shaking so badly he could barely grip the concrete edge. He collapsed onto solid ground, the puppy still clutched to his chest. The mother dog was there instantly, her nose pressing against her baby, whining, licking, frantic. David rolled onto his back, positioning the puppy on his chest. The tiny body was completely limp, soaked, cold as ice. No breath. No movement. The white fur was plastered to ribs so small David could count every one. He pressed 2 fingers against the puppy's chest. Nothing. No heartbeat he could feel. His combat medic training took over, the same training that had kept teammates alive in firefights, the same training he'd used on village children caught in crossfire. But this wasn't a human. The anatomy was different. Smaller. More fragile. David turned the puppy over, supporting its head, and used his thumb to gently sweep its mouth. Water dribbled out. He positioned the tiny body face down across his palm, head lower than its body, and pressed gently on its back. More water came. The puppy remained still. The mother dog's whining climbed higher. Desperate. Breaking. David flipped the puppy onto its back, placed 2 fingers on its chest, and began compressions. Gentle, rhythmic, counting in his head the way he'd been taught. 15 compressions. He lowered his face, sealed his mouth over the puppy's tiny muzzle and nose, and gave the smallest breath he could manage. Too much air would rupture the lungs. Nothing. 15 more compressions. Another breath. Nothing. The mother dog pressed against David's side, her body shaking, her eyes fixed on her baby. She wasn't making a sound anymore. She was just watching, waiting, hoping. "Come on," David whispered, his voice raw. "Come on, little soldier. You didn't survive all that just to quit now." 15 compressions. Breath. His own hands were shaking, his vision blurring with exhaustion and tears and something that felt like prayer. The puppy's chest hitched. David froze. Did it? Had he imagined it? Then the puppy coughed. A weak, wet sound. Its tiny body convulsed, and water erupted from its mouth. The animal gasped, choked, gasped again, and then, miracle of miracles, it let out a sharp, indignant cry that sounded like pure rage at having been woken up. The mother dog exploded with joy. She was everywhere at once, licking her puppy's face, licking David's face, her tail wagging so hard her entire back end moved. She made sounds David had never heard from a dog, somewhere between crying and laughing, pure overwhelming relief. David sat up, cradling the puppy as it continued to cry, louder now, stronger. The tiny body was warming against his chest, its heart beating against his palm like a war drum. "Got you," David whispered, his own tears falling freely now. "I got you. You're okay. You're going home." For the first time in 8 months, David Kyle smiled. The hike back to the trail was brutal. David's body was shutting down, hypothermia setting in for real now. His teeth chattered so hard he thought they might crack. His legs moved on autopilot, muscle memory from forced marches carrying him when conscious thought failed. He'd zipped the puppy inside his jacket against his bare chest, sharing what little body heat he had left. The tiny animal had stopped crying, was breathing steady now, its small heartbeat rapid against David's ribs. The mother dog stayed pressed against his leg the entire climb, no longer leading but following, trusting him completely. Every few steps she'd look up at his jacket where her baby was hidden, her tail giving a small wag of reassurance. When they reached his truck, David's hands were shaking too badly to work the door handle. It took 3 tries. He collapsed into the driver's seat, pulled out his emergency thermal blanket from the survival kit Rebecca had insisted he keep, and wrapped both dogs in silver reflective material. The mother immediately curled around her puppy, licking its face, checking every inch of its small body. David's phone had 1 bar of service. His fingers could barely work the screen. He called the first veterinary clinic that appeared in his search, his voice barely functioning. "I have 2 dogs. Hypothermia. Injuries. I'm 20 minutes out. Sir, we open at 9, you'll need to." "I'm a Navy SEAL." The words came out hard, commanding, the voice he'd used to coordinate airstrikes and evacuations. "These dogs will be there in 20 minutes. Have someone ready or I'll kick the door down myself." 18 minutes later, David carried both dogs through the front door of Mountain View Veterinary Clinic. A young vet tech rushed forward with a gurney, But David didn't put them down. He walked straight into the examination room, the mother dog limping behind him, and only then did he carefully unwrap the thermal blanket. Dr. Sarah Chen, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and capable hands, took one look at the scene, at David's hypothermic state, at the skeletal mother dog, at the puppy barely clinging to life, and simply nodded. "Let's get to work." She tried to guide David to the waiting room. He didn't move. His hand stayed on the mother dog's head, his eyes fixed on the puppy as Dr. Chen began her examination. "Sir, you need medical attention yourself. You're hypothermic, you're bleeding." "I'm not leaving them." David's voice was quiet but absolute. "I left someone once. I'm not doing it again." Dr. Chen studied his face for a long moment, saw something there that made her stop arguing. She pulled up a chair, wrapped another thermal blanket around David's shoulders, and handed him a cup of hot coffee. "Then you stay," she said simply. "But drink this before you pass out on my floor." David's hand was shaking so badly he could barely hold the cup, but he drank. And he stayed. David's story proves that sometimes the most broken among us are exactly the ones meant to heal others. Ghost didn't find David by accident that morning. She found him because some missions choose you, not the other way around. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late for a second chance. Drop a comment telling us what you think David's next rescue should be. And don't forget to subscribe because we have more incredible true stories of courage, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between humans and the animals that save us. And if you or someone you know is a veteran struggling to find purpose after service, organizations like Second Extraction exist all over the country. Sometimes all it takes is one desperate dog and one broken soldier to remind us that heroes aren't born, they're rescued. Thanks for watching. Now go hug your dog. They might just be waiting to save you too.